The first time I swung a sickle across a patch of tall grass, it bounced. It skipped off the stems like a butter knife off a rope, and I stood there sweating, blaming my arms, blaming the weeds, blaming everything except the one thing that was actually wrong. You have felt that. The bind, the tug, the stalk that folds instead of falls. And you did what I did, you gripped harder and swung meaner, and the tool still betrayed you. Ah, here is the truth I paid for the hard way. A sickle that costs $8 can outcut a sickle that costs 80, and it can do it for years if you change one thing that has nothing to do with the steel you bought. The Japanese have known this for almost 400 years. They shaped it into a craft in a little iron town called Sanjo, and the trick they use is sitting on your bench right now, ignored. Stay with me, because near the end I am going to show you a single ground hollow, a shape the old smiths call the yura, that turns a rusted farm sickle into something that shaves grass at a touch. I learned it standing next to a man, in an apron thick with scale, when he took my dull blade, looked at the back of it, not the front, and said one word: wrong side. That sentence rewired how I see every edge I own, and it works on the beat-up sickle already hanging in your shed. Let me walk you through everything he showed me. Let me start with the mistake almost every single one of us makes, because until you see it, nothing else will land. When my sickle skipped off that grass, I assumed the edge was dull, so I did the obvious thing. I dragged it across a bench stone, back and forth, both sides, the way I sharpen a kitchen knife. It got a little better for about 10 minutes, then it went right back to bouncing. I figured I bought a cheap piece of junk. I was half right, and completely wrong about why. Here is what is really happening when a sickle skips. Grass and green stalks are not hard, they are springy. When you swing, the stem tries to bend away from the blade before the edge can bite. If your edge is even slightly too thick, or the angle behind it is too steep, the stalk wins the race. It flexes out of the way and pops back up laughing at you. It is not a sharpness problem in the way you think. It is a geometry problem. The metal directly behind the cutting edge is too fat, so it acts like a tiny wedge shoving the plant away instead of a blade slicing through it. Now here is the number that stopped me cold when the old man drew it in the dirt with a nail. A Western farm sickle usually comes ground with a symmetric edge, a bevel on both sides, and the total angle behind that edge often runs between 40 and 50 degrees. Think about that. 45 degrees of steel trying to enter a soft stem that only needs about 15 to 20 degrees of edge to be sliced clean. You are not cutting. You are hammering a dull wedge into a spring. No wonder it bounces. No wonder your shoulder aches by noon. The Japanese sickle, the kama, is ground completely differently, and the difference is the entire game. Instead of two matching bevels meeting in the middle, the traditional kama is sharpened mostly on one side, with a total edge angle that can drop under 20 degrees. That thin, low, single-sided edge does not shove the stem away. It parts it. The stalk never gets a chance to bend because the blade is already through it before the plant can react. Same swing, same muscle, 10 times the bite. And the only thing that changed was the shape of a few thousandths of an inch of steel. So the first thing I want you to do, before any grinding, before any fancy work, is to go look at your sickle in the light and find the bevel. If you see a fat, blunt, rounded shoulder behind the edge, you have just found the reason it fails. Therefore, the fix is not more force, and it is not a new tool. The fix is thinning that shoulder and shifting toward a single, low bevel. But that raises a much bigger question, and this is where I got angry, because once I understood geometry, I had to ask why nobody sells the sickle ground the right way in the first place. Let me tell you what I found, because it turned my frustration into something colder. When I started paying attention to how cheap Western sickles come from the factory, I noticed they are almost all ground thick and symmetric on purpose. And there is a reason that has nothing to do with cutting and everything to do with cost and complaints. A thick, obtuse edge is cheaper to grind because the tolerance is loose. It survives shipping without chipping. And most importantly, it survives the customer. A blade with a thin, keen, low-angle edge demands a little skill and a little maintenance, and if a first-time buyer chips it on a rock and returns it, the company loses money. So they sell you a blunt wedge that technically has an edge, calls itself a sickle, and disappoints you slowly enough that you blame yourself instead of them. That is the part that got under my skin. The tool is not broken. It is engineered to be mediocre, so it never gets returned, which means you are sold disappointment as a safety feature. The average buyer never learns the difference, so they buy a second one, then a third, then finally an expensive imported blade, thinking the price was the missing ingredient. It was never the price. The imported blade cuts better because someone finally ground the geometry correctly. You have been paying a premium for a shape, and the shape costs nothing. The Sanjo Smiths in Niigata figured this out generations ago, and the reason they got so good is worth knowing, because it is not folklore. Sanjo became an iron town around the 1620s, in the early Edo period, when the local rivers flooded the rice fields so often that farmers could not survive on farming alone. A magistrate encouraged them to make wakugi, traditional nails, through the winter. Those farmers spent generations at the forge, and over time they moved from nails to blades, sickles, knives, chisels, plane irons. By the time the craft matured, they had worked out edge geometry and steel layering to a degree that Western mass production still does not bother to match, because Western mass production is optimizing for the return counter, not for your wrist. And here is the layering secret that makes the whole thing sing, because it answers the obvious objection. You might be thinking, if I grind my edge that thin, will it not just bend or chip? That is exactly the right question. And the Japanese answer is called awase, or sanmai laminated steel. A traditional kama is not one uniform bar of metal. It is a hard, high-carbon steel edge, forge-welded to a softer, tougher iron body. The hard steel at the edge can be taken to a Rockwell hardness of around 63 to 65 on the C scale, hard enough to hold a razor line. The soft back, sitting down around 30-something, absorbs shock and keeps the whole thing from snapping. So you get an edge harder than almost any Western farm tool, wrapped in a body tougher than any hardened blade could ever be. Thin does not mean fragile when the metal behind it is built in two personalities. Now I can already hear the pushback, because it is the exact pushback I threw at the old man on day one. I told him, that is fine for a hand-forged laminated blade from Japan, but I do not own one of those. I own a stamped, single-piece, mystery steel sickle from a hardware bin, and I am not about to forge weld anything. And this is the part I want to slow down for, because if you are sitting there with a plain, worn, rusty sickle, thinking this whole video is about some special tool you would have to buy, this next part is built for you specifically. This is the part that changed my mind, because you do not need laminated steel to steal most of the benefit. You need geometry, and geometry is free. Here is exactly what I did to a rusty $8 sickle that had been living in a bucket of old bolts, and it now outcuts a name-brand blade I paid real money for. First, I clamped it, and looked at which side had the most grinding wear that becomes my primary bevel side. Then, with nothing but a cheap flat file and a bit of patience, I started laying that file at a low angle, roughly 15 degrees, and working only the primary side, not both sides, one side. I let the back stay almost flat. I filed until I could feel the edge get thin, until the light stopped reflecting off a fat, rounded shoulder and started disappearing into a crisp line. The reason a file works here, and works better than a power grinder for most people, is heat. This matters more than anyone tells you. When you take a bench grinder to a thin edge and you see it turn blue or straw-colored, you have just ruined it. That color is the steel losing its temper, the hardness cooking right out of it above roughly 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. A blade that got hot and turned blue at the edge will go dull in one afternoon no matter how sharp you made it. And this is the single most common mistake I see in the comments on every sickle video. People grinding hot and then wondering why the edge folds. A hand file cuts cold. It cannot overheat the steel. So on a mystery metal sickle where you have no idea how it was hardened, the file is not the slow option. It is the smart option because it protects whatever hardness is already in there. After the file, I went to a stone, any stone, a cheap combination water stone, a puck, even wet dry sandpaper laid on a flat piece of glass. I kept the same low angle on the primary side, and I raised a burr, that tiny wire of metal that curls over to the back when you have finally reached the very edge. Feeling that burr appear along the whole length is how you know you actually sharpened the edge and not just the shoulder above it. Then I flipped to the flat back and, keeping it dead flat against the stone, I took 2 or 3 light passes just to knock that burr off. Not to sharpen the back, just to remove the wire. That is a single bevel sickle now, built from a bin blade, and it cost me nothing but 20 minutes. I took that rusty resurrected thing out to the same patch of grass that humiliated me a year earlier. It did not bounce. It whispered through the stalks like they were not even there, and the cut stems fell in a line instead of springing back up. I stood there almost annoyed, because I had thrown away or given up on 3 sickles before anyone told me the fix was the shape and not the sticker price. Therefore, if you take nothing else from me today, take this. Your worn-out sickle is probably not worn out. It is just wearing the wrong angle. But even a perfect single bevel is only 2/3 of what the master eventually showed me, and the last third is the part almost nobody outside that craft ever sees. That instinct, the one that made you click a title about turning a sickle into something worth a fortune, that instinct is correct, and it is worth defending. If you want to go deeper into this way of thinking, the geometry, the history, the specific moves that separate a craftsman from a buyer, I have written all of it out in my books Tool Mind, Steel Instinct, and Tool Master. They cover exactly this kind of knowledge. The shapes, the angles, the forgotten craft logic that factories quietly buried so you would keep buying new tools instead of mastering the ones you already own. You will find links to all 3 in the description below. They are the bench notes I wish someone had handed me before I threw away those first 3 sickles. Now, back to the sickle in your shed, because even a perfect single bevel is only 2/3 of what the master eventually showed me, and the last third is the part almost nobody outside that craft ever sees. Let me set up the piece that ties it together, because thin geometry has a hidden enemy, and if you do not solve it, your beautiful new edge will slowly betray you. The enemy is the burr and the flat back working against each other over time. Here is the problem. Every time your edge dulls in the field and you go to touch it up, you sharpen the primary bevel, you raise a new burr, and you flip to the back to remove it. Simple. But if that back is truly perfectly flat across its whole width, then every time you lay it on the stone you are grinding the entire flat face. Do that a few hundred times over a season, and you slowly wear the back into a rounded belly. The edge climbs, and one day your razor sickle is dull again, and you cannot figure out why the same routine stopped working. I watched this happen to my own blade, and I could not explain it. The old man could. He turned the sickle over, ran his thumb along the back, and shook his head at how flat I had made it. "Wrong side," he said again. "You never gave it the hollow. This is the secret finale, and it is the single most elegant thing I learned in all my time at that bench. It is called the urasuki, the hollow ground into the back of a traditional Japanese single bevel blade. If you have ever looked closely at a real Japanese chisel or a kitchen knife or a proper kama and wondered why the back is not flat, why it has a shallow, scooped-out valley running down the middle with only a thin, flat rim around the edges, that hollow is not decoration, and it is not an accident. It is possibly the most underrated piece of edge engineering ever devised, and it has been documented in Japanese blade making for centuries, refined in exactly those Sanjo and Ekizen forge towns where the craft grew up. Here is why the Urasuki is genius, and once you understand it, you will never sharpen a single bevel edge any other way. By grinding a shallow hollow into the back of the blade, the smith leaves only a very thin rim of flat steel running right along the cutting edge and up the spine. When you lay that back on a sharpening stone, you are no longer grinding the entire wide face. You are only touching that thin rim. Think about what that means. To remove a burr and refresh the back, you now only have to polish a sliver of metal a millimeter or two wide instead of the whole width of the blade. It takes seconds. It stays flat where it counts. And because you are removing so little steel each time, the blade lasts for decades of sharpenings instead of wearing into a belly in a single season. The hollow does the work of protecting the geometry for you automatically every time you touch it to a stone. And it gets better, because that thin rim also makes the edge sharper than a flat back ever could. A flat back has to make full contact across a wide surface, which means any tiny imperfection in your stone or your hand tilts the whole thing and rounds the edge. The narrow Urasuki rim registers cleanly and flatly with almost no effort, so you hit the exact same plane every single time, and the edge meets it at a truer, keener line. That is why a properly maintained single bevel blade with a hollow back can be brought back to shaving sharp in 3 or 4 passes in the field, while your flat-backed sickle needs a full resharpening. The hollow is the reason Japanese blades have a reputation for taking an edge that seems impossible. It was never magic steel, it was a scooped-out valley you could not see. Now here is the part that made me grin like a kid, because you are about to think this requires a master smith and a forge, and it does not. You can put a functional Urasuki into your own cheap sickle this weekend with tools you already own. Here is exactly how I did it. Clamp the sickle with the back facing up. Take a rotary tool with a small grinding stone, or the edge of a grinding wheel, or even a half-round file if you are patient, and very gently grind a shallow, smooth hollow down the center of the back running along the length, staying well away from the actual cutting edge. You are not trying to dig a trench. You are removing maybe a fraction of a millimeter, a soft, shallow scoop, leaving an untouched flat rim of steel along the cutting edge and a strip along the spine. The 2 flat strips, edge and spine, are what will ride the stone. Everything between them drops away into the hollow so it never touches the stone again. 2 warnings, because I learned both the hard way. First, keep it cool. If you are using anything powered, go light and dip the blade in water constantly, because you are grinding near an edge you already worked hard to harden, and one blue spot undoes everything. Cold and slow wins. Second, never grind the hollow all the way to the edge. Always leave that thin, flat rim intact right at the cutting line, because that rim is your edge reference and your strength. Grind that away and you have a weak, wavy mess. Leave it, and you have a blade that registers flat, sharpens in seconds, and holds its geometry for years. The first time I flattened the back of my hollow ground sickle on a stone, I actually laughed out loud, because instead of grinding away at a wide, stubborn face for 2 minutes, the burr came off in one light pass. The edge went from grabbing my thumbnail to gliding off it, sharper than I had ever gotten that blade before, in about 10 seconds. Then I took it to the field, and it cut wet spring grass so cleanly the tops slid off sideways instead of tearing. An $8 bin sickle, resurrected with a file and a scooped-out back, doing what the smiths in Sanjo built into their blades 400 years ago and what no factory will ever bother to grind for you, because the hollow takes skill and skill costs money, and you were only ever meant to buy the cheap wedge and blame yourself. Let me pull the whole thing together, because I want you to walk away holding the complete picture and not just 3 separate tricks. Your sickle bounces because the edge angle is too fat, so it wedges the stalk away instead of slicing it. You fix that by grinding a single low bevel around 15 to 20 degrees on one side only, using a file so you never overheat and destroy the hardness. That alone will beat most store-bought blades. But then, to make that thin edge last, and to make sharpening effortless for years, you grind a shallow Urasuki hollow into the back, leaving a thin, flat rim at the edge and spine, so every future touch-up takes seconds, and the geometry protects itself. 3 moves. No forge, no new tool, no premium price. Just the shape the old craft always knew and the industry always hoped you would not. And I want to name the thing that actually shifted in me, because it was bigger than Sickle's. Before that apron-covered man turned my blade over and said, "Wrong side," I thought a tool's quality was something I bought, a number on a tag, a brand I could trust. Standing at his bench, watching a rusted piece of junk turn into something that cut like a dream because of a hollow I could grind myself, I understood that quality was never something I purchased. It was something I could put into the metal with my own hands. That is the whole thing. That is what you actually get back today. Not a sharper sickle, the end of being at the mercy of the tool aisle. Because you are not the kind of person who wants to be sold a wedge and told to be grateful. If you have read this far, you are the kind who would rather understand the shape of an edge than pay 4 times the price for someone else to grind it badly. You would rather resurrect the blade in the bucket than buy the 5th new one. That instinct, the one that made you click a title about turning a sickle into something worth a fortune, that instinct is correct, and it is worth defending. So here is what I want from you. And I am asking directly because I know this crowd reads more than it types. Go find the oldest, most neglected sickle you own, turn it over, and look at the back. Is it dead flat? Or has it already started to round into a belly from years of wrong sharpening? Tell me in the comments what you see on the back of your blade, because that back tells the whole story of how it was treated, and I read every one of them. And while you are there, tell me where in the world you are swinging that sickle, because this craft traveled from a flooded river town in Japan to benches all over the planet, and I love knowing where it landed. If the idea of taking the junk tool and making it outperform the expensive one is the kind of thing you want more of, then stay with me here, because this is a workshop of people quietly refusing to be sold garbage, and every blade we resurrect is one the factory hoped we would replace. I am taking this same hollowback thinking to a tool next that will surprise you even more than the sickle did, an ordinary garden shovel that most people sharpen completely wrong or never sharpen at all, and the single ground edge that turns it into something that slices through packed clay and roots like they were sand. The back of that shovel hides the same secret the back of your sickle did. Turn your blades over. Look at the wrong side. That is where the master was hiding the whole time. Now, this video showed you why the sickle skips, and the shape that fixes it. But the real work is the full Euro grind on your own blade. And I walk you through it, step by step, inside the Workshop Guild. In there, ask me your own question, and I answer you myself, a real person. And you won't be alone. You'll belong. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel any time with one click. No risk.